They thought I was too old to fight them. What they forgot was, I taught them how to lie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Nora Langford. I am 72 years old, recently widowed, and formerly the legal guardian of one of the most complicated families in Chester County. I am also, as of last Tuesday, a trespasser in my own home. At least, that's what the Langford children would have the world believe. They call me stepmother when they're feeling kind. Interloper on worse days, which when they think I'm not listening. But Walter, my husband of 25 years, called me his cornerstone, his co-counsel, his calm. He also, it turns out, called someone else his executor, a woman he didn't name in the first 17 drafts of his will. They presented the new version the night of his funeral, like pallbearers offering me one last insult to carry alone. But I know the law, and I know this. Dead men don't change witnesses. The night they read the will, the wine was red, the table long, and the air colder than the grave we'd just buried Walter in. I sat at the far end of the dining table, his table, the same mahogany slab Walter had fought to keep when his son, Garrett, insisted on renovating the estate to market standards. The same table where I once fed all 3 of those children spoonfuls of legacy when their mother disappeared into pills and charity galas. And now? They wouldn't even make eye contact. Claire was the first to speak. She always had the softest voice, and perhaps that's why she was chosen to deliver the blow. "Nora," she said, reaching across the table to gently touch my hand. Her fingers were smooth, cold, impersonal. "We thought it would be best to go over the updated estate documents tonight. Just to avoid confusion." The only confusion in the room was how she thought I wouldn't recognize the tremble in her wrist. She pushed forward a folder, white, clean, unassuming. But it might as well have been a knife. I opened it slowly. 16 pages. All signed. All initialed. Walter's name at the bottom. Not a signature stamp. Not a copy. An actual wet signature, blue ink, slightly smudged. It looked real. It looked practiced. Which is exactly why I didn't trust it. "Where was this executed?" I asked. "Here, at the house," said Garrett. Too quickly. "Which notary?" He hesitated. Claire jumped in again. "A private one. Walter said he wanted it quiet." I looked down the table. Lila, the youngest, sat still as a statue, too quiet for someone who used to scream over orange juice pulp. Her eyes were red. Not from mourning. From guilt. That was when I knew. This wasn't grief. It was a hostile takeover. The will claimed to revoke all prior versions. Declared me a resident in good standing at the Langford estate, entitled to continued occupancy in the guest annex for as long as reasonably sustainable. Guest annex. I had renovated that annex with my own hands, paid for it with funds from my own trust. I read the last clause twice, letting it brand me, "All property, financial assets, and business interests shall pass to the Langford children, equally, to be administered by Garrett Langford, executor." Not me. Not Walter's wife. Not the woman who filed every deed under his name for 2 decades. Them. I closed the folder slowly, deliberately. "Walter never showed me this," I said. Garrett leaned back, arms crossed. "Dad didn't want to burden you with it." His words. I stood. "No," I said, folding the pages neatly back into the folder. What he didn't want was a fight. Then I looked him dead in the eye. But he should have known he married a woman who doesn't lose. They watched me walk away like I was some relic finally blowing out in the wind. They had no idea they'd just lit a fire. Because that wasn't Walter's will. It was a forgery. And I was going to prove it. I found it 3 days after the funeral. Tucked in a dusty folder at the back of Walter's upstairs study, an old manila file labeled in his distinct cursive, Langford, Parcels C, W, and N. Parcel C. That was what we called the eastern tract of land behind the orchard, the part with the defunct stables and the ivy-covered guest house I'd renovated myself. A beautiful corner of the estate nobody ever talked about but everyone wanted a piece of. And inside that folder, folded precisely in half, was a deed. Not the newest version. Not the one Garrett submitted to the probate office. This was older. Real. And someone had tried to throw it away. The paper was heavier than modern legal stock. The kind I preferred, thick, textured, stubborn in a way that demanded respect. Across the top, the header still read, Property Deed Transfer, Langford Estate Parcel C. Then, in red ink, were Walter's marginal notes, my husband's ever-meticulous commentary. Nora and I agreed on co-ownership. This must be formalized before year-end. Add survivorship clause, protect from disputes. She paid for renovations. Reflect in equity split. I recognized the pen immediately. It was one of mine. I'd given it to Walter last fall, an old Montblanc from the firm days, with just enough ink left for a few good signatures. It bled ever so slightly on thicker parchment. But what struck me most wasn't the notes. It was what wasn't there. The signature. Walter's. Mine. Neither of us had signed it. I flipped the page and found a second version. This one had been scanned. Dated 2 months prior to his death. The red ink comments were gone. The ownership structure had changed. Instead of Walter and Nora Langford, the listed owner was Langford Holdings Incorporated Trustee, Garrett Langford, no co-owner. No survivorship clause. No record of my renovations. It was as if I had never existed. I stared at the page for a long while, feeling that eerie cold crawl of gaslight creep into my spine. The kind that whispers, maybe you imagined it. Maybe you were never really part of this. But I am not a woman who forgets. And I never imagined deeds. Back in the garden annex, the guest space they now referred to with a straight face as my residency, I pulled out my personal files. I still kept hard copies. Always had. It was a dying habit, like thank you notes or integrity. And there, under Estate Projects, 2001 to 2018, I found the original invoice from the architectural firm I'd hired. Stamped. Signed. Paid in full from my private trust account. I pulled out the statement and laid it beside the altered deed. Side by side. Past and fiction. Truth and theft. I needed a witness. And there was only one person left who'd seen those early negotiations take place. Lenora Shaw. Walter's former legal secretary. Retired now. Moved upstate to look after her sister. We hadn't spoken since the holiday party 3 years ago when she told me, after a bit too much eggnog, that Garrett was the type of boy who thought inheritance was just a matter of patience. I dialed her number. She answered on the 3rd ring. Lenora, I said. It's Nora Langford. A pause. Then, I heard. I need your memory, I said. And maybe your notes. Another pause. Longer. Then, come tomorrow. I kept everything. I hung up and looked out the window toward the orchard. The autumn leaves were just starting to turn, their edges amber, curling, crisp. Change was coming. But not the kind they expected. They thought removing me from paper meant removing me from power. What they forgot was I never needed a page to hold my ground. I wrote the damn clauses. That night, I slid the red-lined deed into a separate folder and labeled it in block letters, Original Intent, Exhibit A, the first of many. Because now I had a plan. I wasn't just going to prove the new will was forged. I was going to unwrite their entire inheritance, one stolen signature at a time. Of the 3 Langford children, Claire had always been the one who lingered. Never quite a leader like Garrett, never as emotionally messy as Lila. Claire was the one who stayed in the background, organizing the spreadsheets, delivering the family news in even tones, folding her napkin perfectly in half at every dinner. But silence isn't neutrality. It's strategy. And silence under pressure? That's complicity. I found her 2 days later, sitting in the conservatory off the east veranda, surrounded by what remained of Walter's orchid collection. She'd always loved that space, the filtered light, the illusion of calm. I didn't announce myself. Just stepped inside, quiet as memory. She didn't look up. You shouldn't be here, she said, voice low. Neither should you, I replied, if you knew what they've done. That made her pause. Claire set down her pruning shears. She turned slowly to face me, but not all the way. Just enough for me to see the discomfort. The internal argument. I didn't forge anything, she said quickly. But you knew, I said. She swallowed. Claire, don't insult either of us with silence. She stood, straightened her sweater like it was armor. I didn't agree with what Garrett did. But Dad was declining and you weren't exactly present in those final weeks. I felt that one. A well-placed jab. Not because it was true, but because it was almost true. Walter had been distant in those final weeks. Withdrawn. Preoccupied. I'd thought it was grief, or fatigue, or the slow crawl of mortality catching up to a man who had dodged it for too long. But now? I wondered if he'd known, if he'd suspected what they were planning. Or worse, if they'd already started. Walter was dying, Claire continued. And Garrett said, he said this was what Dad wanted. That you'd agreed. That it would avoid court drama, public filings. You know how Dad felt about appearances. And you didn't think to ask me if that was true? I did. Her voice cracked. Do you think I don't feel sick every time I walk into this house now? Do you think I don't hear his voice in my head, wondering what we did? Then why stay quiet? Claire looked away. Because he's my brother. And she's my sister. And you're just, she stopped herself. But it was too late. Just the wife. Just the second. Just the outsider. I walked past her and picked up one of the orchid pots. You know these aren't really delicate, I said, fingers brushing the petal. They just pretend to be. They need discipline. Root care. You know what happens when you overwater an orchid. She said nothing. It rots from the inside. Slowly, quietly. Then it collapses. I set the pot down and turned to her. Like this family, I left her standing there. No shouting. No accusations. Just facts left hanging in the air like steam. Later that evening, a message arrived in my email inbox. No subject. No body. Just a scanned image. A draft of the First Amendment to Walter's estate plan, dated 4 months before he died. The file name was Langford_revision_draft_NL. PDF in the margin, Walter's handwriting. Nora to retain full co-executive power. No changes unless she signs. Attached was a second file. A calendar invite. Walter's notary appointment. Cancelled. Date: 11 days before his death. Claire never said she sent it. She didn't have to. Some silences break louder than words. That night, I added the documents to a new binder labeled Exhibit B, nullified attempts 2 exhibits down. The story was starting to write itself. But I wasn't done gathering ink. Because next, I was going to speak to the one person who always knew everything Walter touched, Mrs. Dean, the housekeeper. I hadn't spoken to Mrs. Dean in weeks, not since before Walter's funeral, when she came into the kitchen carrying a tray of lemon tea and gave me a look that said I know, but without saying a word. She was the only employee left from the early years of our marriage. The rest, drivers, groundskeepers, caterers, had long since been replaced by younger, more polished professionals hired by Garrett's handpicked estate consultant. But Mrs. Dean had outlasted them all, because she had seen them all. And she remembered everything. I found her in the linen room, folding towels like she was sculpting marble. She didn't look up as I entered. I thought you might come, she said, matter of fact. How long have you known? I asked. Her hands paused, only for a second. Long enough. She placed a towel on the shelf, turned, and faced me with those small, sharp eyes that missed nothing. Do you remember what Walter used to say about trust? I nodded. He said it was like salt. Easy to sprinkle. Impossible to separate once you stirred it in. She smiled sadly. Well, someone poured a lot into the wrong pot. She motioned for me to follow her. We walked the narrow servants' hallway behind the kitchen, past the disused cold storage, and came to a door I hadn't opened in over a decade. The old laundry office. Inside, the room was clean but outdated. Green filing cabinets, a metal desk, an old printer that looked like it belonged in a Cold War bunker. She knelt down beside the last cabinet and produced a shoebox. A simple one. Labeled, Langford Legal 2003 to 2022, clean copies. I made duplicates, she said. Everything he signed. Everything he handed me to file away properly. He didn't trust the digital system. Never liked how Garrett's people handled things. She opened the box. Inside were dozens of folders, all neatly separated, labeled by year. And in one of them, 2021, I found it, the original trust deed, Walter's signature. Mine beside it, a line that read, co-owners with joint survivorship intent. Reversion clause if disputed. My thumb ran over the ink like it was a relic. A time capsule. And then she handed me a second document. Hold for notary. Deed revision. Cancelled. Walter had written across the top in red pen, do not use. Nora has not agreed. This is draft only. It was all there. Proof that I'd never consented to the changes. Proof that Walter never finalized them. Proof that everything Garrett filed was a fabrication. You held on to this, I whispered. All this time. She nodded. I buried 2 husbands on this land, she said softly. I've seen too many women disappear from the record just because a louder man decided it was easier that way. Then she handed me the box. You don't owe me anything, she said. But don't let them rewrite you. That evening, I cleared the dining table in the garden annex. Laid out every copy. Scanned each one to a password-protected flash drive. Then I labeled the next folder in my growing binder, Exhibit C, Primary Evidence, Hard Copy, and beneath that, in pen, Mrs. Dean's box. The Langfords thought they erased me from the story, but they forgot that housekeepers see everything. The lies, the drafts, the scraps in the trash. And sometimes, they keep receipts. Walter was a man of rituals. Every second Friday of the month, he visited the Langford Trust Bank sharply at 10, always in his navy suit, the one with the pocket square I ironed each morning. When I asked what he did there, he would smile and say, just tending the garden, Nora. Weeds grow even in vaults. I assumed it was estate work. Nothing more. But I should have known Walter never visited anything that often unless it meant control. After discovering the forged deed and the originals in Mrs. Dean's shoebox, I knew the will they'd presented wasn't the end of their deceit. It was just the beginning. So I returned to the Langford Trust Bank. Not as a grieving widow. As a title attorney with 25 years of quiet litigation behind her and one final key to turn. The receptionist was young, polite, and guarded the way all small-town institutions do when old names walk through the doors. But I'd been here before. Enough times to know how the vault system worked. Enough to know which manager Walter trusted. Harvey Lang, I said. Tell him Nora's here. Tell him I'm not leaving without a room. 10 minutes later, Harvey appeared. Older, balder, and even more nervously deferential than I remembered. Nora, he said with a tight smile. We didn't expect you. That's clear, I replied. I need access to Walter's safe deposit boxes. Both of them. His face twitched. I can't disclose details. His designated heirs, I pulled out a copy of the original deed. The one signed, witnessed, and legally notarized before the revision. Walter never revoked my authority. If he did, it wasn't legal. And if this bank honored any instruction that contradicted this without probate review, I'll have a subpoena filed before you finish your next sentence. His silence said enough. He led me to the vault. Inside, Harvey paused before 2 boxes. One was labeled with the Langford Family Trust Code, LFT 2127. The one Garrett and his sisters claimed. The second was older. Darker metal. Stamped faintly, NL 3714. Not Langford family. Nora Langford. He opened it, then gave me space. Inside were 4 envelopes. One labeled to be opened upon my death, Nora only. One marked Final Deed, Langford Parcel C. Another labeled Voice Memo, July 14th. And a last one with the words, The Quiet Deed, handwritten on the front. I pulled up a chair and opened the first. Asterisk, Nora, if you're reading this, I've either passed or I'm too cowardly to face what's coming. I've made mistakes. I know Garrett's grown into someone you barely recognize. And I know I fed that by protecting him too long. But this box is the truth. The one no one can revise. I drafted a deed in your name. A will that reflects what we built. I never revoked it, Nora, not really. They tried to scare me into signing a new one, but I didn't finish it. I couldn't. Keep this. Use it. Burn it if you want. But know this, you were always the rightful heir. Walter, asterisk, I opened the second envelope. Inside was the corrected version of the final deed, signed by Walter and myself, with an added page, an amendment naming me as surviving property custodian in the event of any internal legal challenge. Attached was the voice memo. I plugged it into my phone. His voice crackled through. This is Walter Langford. Date July 14th. I hereby declare that the revised will signed by Garrett Langford and notarized on July 22nd was a draft only. I did not sign the witness sheet knowingly. Any will submitted under that date is false. Nora has always been co-owner of the estate. That was our agreement. Any indication otherwise should be considered null and void. It wasn't emotional. It was legal. And ironclad. The kind of thing only a man like Walter would leave behind. A quiet nuke sealed in a box no one else could touch. I copied everything. Photographed the voice memo. Preserved every document. Then I locked the originals back inside. As I closed the lid, my hand brushed against the inside lip of the box. There, carved in tiny, deliberate letters, were 5 words. This was always yours, Nora. That night, I returned to the estate and pulled out a new folder. Labeled it Exhibit D, Safe Deposit Contents, then I added a sticky note beneath it, written in my own hand. Control doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And mine was just starting to get loud. It was always Walter's habit to keep the sensitive files in the lowest drawer of his desk, the one with the brass key and the stiff hinge. He called it the shadow box. You don't bury secrets, he used to say. You catalog them. And so I went cataloging. The drawer creaked open like a confession. Dust clung to the edges like guilt that hadn't been aired out in years. Inside, there were 4 thick folders, one for each child and a 4th marked, Seals, Private. Hold, I opened the 4th first. Inside were legal documents. Confidential settlements. 4 of them. Each one signed within the past 10 years. Each one sealed. Each one tied not to Walter, but to his children. The first was a settlement involving Garrett. A breach of fiduciary duty claim from a former investment client. Buried under layers of legal language was this line. In exchange for silence, the complainant receives $600,000 from the Langford Holdings Discretionary Fund. Executor, Walter Langford. Executor, not Garrett. But the incident happened during Garrett's tenure at the company, long after Walter had retired from day-to-day operations. Walter took the fall. He shielded his son, even after knowing what he was capable of. The second document involved Lila, a complaint filed by a former tenant in one of the Langford properties, allegations of unsafe conditions, rent fraud, uninhabitable conditions despite premium pricing. Walter signed a non-disclosure agreement on her behalf. Another payout, another cover-up, another favor. But it was the 3rd file, the one marked Claire, that made my stomach turn. It wasn't financial. It was personal. A paternity claim. From a former university professor. Against Claire. She had gotten pregnant. Covered it up. Told no one. Not even her siblings. Paid off the man when he came back years later threatening to go public. Walter handled it, sealed it, silenced it, buried it, and yet she'd still let them cut me out of the will. I sat there, papers trembling in my hand, not from age, from realization. Walter hadn't just protected them. He'd been manipulated by them. Again and again. His final months weren't driven by fear of death. They were choked by blackmail. The fourth file was different. It was thinner. Inside was only a letter. To my successor, whoever you are, if you found these, it means I never cleaned the mess I made. Or worse, I let the mess rewrite me. These settlements were never supposed to happen. I let the name Langford be bartered, hidden, bent to shame. I was weak, but I was never blind. Nora, if it's you, clean this. Even if it means burning everything. Walter, I scanned every document, archived the evidence, created a new folder. Exhibit E, motive, and leverage, the kind of exhibit that doesn't just prove forgery. It proves intent. Why the Langford children needed me gone. Why they were so willing to falsify signatures, shred deeds, revise property codes. I was the only person alive who could testify to Walter's actual wishes. So they buried him in silence. And tried to do the same to me. That night, I lit a fire in the garden hearth, not to destroy, but to remember. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply whispered his name once into the flame. You tried, Walter. But you should have trusted me to finish it. It started with a scent. Faint at first, almost ignorable. The kind of scent you chalk up to an old house sighing in its sleep, dry wood, perhaps, or dust hitting a radiator. But then the alarm screamed. And I knew. The guest wing was burning. The fire began in the small writing room at the end of the corridor, my private annex office, the place where I had kept a copy of everything, the deeds, the voice memos, the settlement scans. Nothing original, but everything that mattered. By the time I reached it, the flames had chewed through half the room. The windows shattered outward from the heat. Smoke curled like black vines around the doorframe. And just beyond the scorched mahogany desk, I saw it, my binder. Melted, charred, gutted, gone. The fire department arrived too late to save the room. Electrical, one said, examining the fuse box. Old wiring, another added. Unstable this time of year. But I knew better. The writing room had been updated just last fall. New circuits. Certified. It wasn't the house that failed. It was someone else. Someone who needed those records gone. Garrett didn't come to check on me. Lila texted a half-hearted, "Hope you're okay," from the Hamptons. Claire sent flowers. No apology. No inquiry. Just silence. Guilt blooms in silence. But what they didn't know, what no one in that house understood, was that I never kept just one copy. The originals were safe. Archived off-site. Password protected. Sealed under legal lock. What they burned was a decoy. A curated narrative I'd left behind for exactly this outcome. And now I had proof they weren't just trying to erase me on paper. They were escalating. That night, I stood in the ruins of the guest wing and found something small beneath the desk, a matchbox. Black, glossy, and entirely out of place. From a private club in the city. The Marlin House, Garrett's favorite haunt. I turned it in my hand, staring at the embossed goldfish logo. He'd been here. Or someone he sent had. And they'd made a mistake. The following morning, I filed a formal incident report with the fire marshal's office. But I added something else, too. A request to preserve the camera footage from the Langford Estates South Garden security feed. The one nobody ever bothered to reroute after Walter died. The one that pointed conveniently at the guest wing. And when I reviewed the footage later that night, at 2:13 a.m., a figure appeared on screen. Tall, hooded, familiar gait. Entered through the south garden. Exited alone, 15 minutes later. But before leaving, the figure paused, just long enough to look directly into the camera. The face was grainy. But I knew it. Lila. I rewound it 5 times. Watched the same pause. The same tilt of her head. The same slight smirk. The baby of the family. The most unpredictable. The most desperate. The one who'd lost her trust fund 2 years ago after a bad investment, an investment Walter had refused to cover. And now? She was the one most invested in removing me. I printed stills from the footage, labeled and filed them. Exhibit F, malicious intent. Then I added a second folder, criminal addendum, arson, suspect, L. Because now it wasn't just about property. It wasn't about inheritance. It was personal. And if they were willing to burn me out of my own home, they were going to learn what fire really looked like. Walter never trusted emails. He said they were too easy to hack, too easy to erase, too easy to twist. A voice he once told me, that's what they can't change, at least not without losing the tremble. Which is why he used a dictaphone. Every major decision, every revision, every clause he debated, he recorded his thoughts into that small black device and had them transcribed later. It was old school, inefficient, and, as it turns out, brilliant. Because they changed the documents. They manipulated the deeds. They even tried to burn the evidence. But they didn't know about the tapes. I found them in the attic. Not in a safe. Not hidden in a false drawer. Just sitting in an unlabeled cardboard box wedged between holiday decorations and a stack of faded legal journals. Walter's old dictation cassettes. 37 of them. Some marked, some blank, some too damaged to play. But one stood out. Taped shut with a red label across the top. W.L. Final Revisions, July 2022. Private. I held the cassette like it was a grenade. Because I already knew what was on it. I could feel it. Back in the annex, I dug out an old player and clicked it in. The hiss of tape filled the room. Then his voice. Clear. Measured. Familiar. Dictation, July 17th, 2022. Final thoughts on estate revisions. Nora is to retain co-ownership of the Langford estate in its entirety. Any modifications must be reviewed and signed by her, in my presence, before being considered valid. I have concerns about Garrett's recent actions. He's been pushing for full control. He approached me with a version of the will that excludes Nora. I declined. He says it's for clarity, but I think he wants freedom from accountability. Claire and Lila, they're silent. Which is worse? I'm afraid they'll say nothing until it's done. Long pause. If this tape is ever heard by anyone but me, it means I failed to stop them. And if that's true, Nora, I'm sorry. Fight them. Don't let the Langford name become a synonym for betrayal. You built this legacy with me. You deserve the last word. I sat still for a long time after the tape ended. Not because I was broken. Because I was angry. The kind of anger that doesn't boil. It settles into your marrow and begins to sharpen. Walter knew. And he left me the only thing stronger than a forged signature or a sealed document. His voice. His truth. The next morning, I met with Meredith Dean, Walter's former probate liaison. She still practiced law part-time and owed me 2 favors. I played her the tape. She listened in silence. When it ended, she looked me in the eye and said, "Do you want quiet pressure or a public hearing?" I didn't hesitate. Public. She nodded. Then we file for evidentiary override. And the tape will be authenticated, certified, filed, and, if we're lucky, admitted as pre-death testimony. That phrase hit like thunder. Pre-death testimony. Legal, unalterable, and damning. That night, I created a new folder. Exhibit G, audio. Walter's dictation. I burned backup copies. Uploaded them to 3 drives. Sent one to Vanessa, my old clerk now working as a probate lawyer upstate. She'd already promised to testify if I needed her. And I added a handwritten note. Let them hear you, Walter. Loud. Because now, even dead? My husband was about to testify. The Langford estate has always been filled with secrets. Not just the whispered kind, the real ones. The kind hidden in the blueprints. When Walter and I renovated the West Library in 2007, we discovered something behind the shelves, a narrow cavity, about 4 feet wide and lined in plaster. Walter wanted to seal it off. I didn't. We built around it instead. Installed false paneling. Aesthetic symmetry, we called it. But now, I realized what I'd created wasn't just a hidden pocket. It was a vault. I returned to the library late that evening. Alone. The house was dark. Garrett and Lila had retreated to the city, no doubt assuming the fire had erased the last of my leverage. Claire had gone radio silent since the tape. They were scattering like roaches who'd sensed the light coming. Good. Because what I was about to uncover would burn brighter than any fire they could have lit. The West Library panel gave way with a hollow thump. Behind it, tucked into the narrow recess, was a single metal cylinder. Cool. Heavy. I unscrewed the cap. Inside was one document, rolled tightly and wrapped in cloth. Old. Yellowed at the edges. The paper type used before most offices moved to digital storage. Stamped on the back, filed, Chester County Records Office, June 2004. I unrolled it carefully, flattening the corners against the wood table with trembling fingers. It was exactly what I thought it would be. Langford Estate Master Deed, 2004 amendment signed by Walter and me. Co-owners. Survivorship clause. Permanent occupancy clause. Irrevocable unless both parties revoked in writing, notarized, and certified. No such revocation ever existed. And attached? A post-it note. Yellowed. Faint. But unmistakably in Walter's handwriting. If they come for you, this is yours. The room spun slightly as I read it again. Because this wasn't just a legal fallback. This was Walter's last chess move. One final insurance policy he didn't trust to lawyers or vaults or fireproof safes. He trusted it to the wall. To the house itself. To me. I made 4 certified copies the next morning. One to the Attorney General's liaison handling the evidentiary override. One to my own probate counsel. One to the media liaison at the Chester County Herald, who had been sniffing around ever since the guest wing accident. And one for the court clerk who had accepted Garrett's version of the will. Because this time, the burden of silence was no longer mine. It was theirs. I labeled the original as Exhibit H, Physical Deed, Wall File. I placed it in the front of my binder, centerpiece, crown jewel, cornerstone. Then I prepared a small press statement. 6 lines. Measured. Undeniable. As the lawful co-owner of the Langford estate and named party in Walter Langford's surviving deed, I am exercising my right to resume control of the property and request immediate suspension of all Langford trust transactions pending probate reevaluation. All supplemental evidence will be made available to the press and probate court as of Friday, 9 a.m. Respectfully, Nora Langford. I printed it, sealed it, mailed it. Then I poured myself a glass of Walter's favorite single malt, stepped out onto the balcony, and breathed in the sharp scent of wood smoke and falling leaves. This wasn't over, but it was close. Because they buried me in paperwork. They torched my room. They silenced every name I had carved beside his. And still, they missed the deed in the wall. They didn't expect me to show up. Not in person, at least. The Langford children believed I'd send a lawyer, file a quiet objection, maybe make a few public statements that could be swept under a rug with enough money and influence. But there I was, hair tied neatly, black dress sharp at the collar, binder in hand, standing at the steps of the Chester County Probate Court just after 8:45 a.m. And when I walked through those doors, the entire chamber tilted. Because no one expected the woman they'd written off to walk in holding every receipt. The courtroom itself was modest, dark oak paneling, pale sunlight filtering through frosted windows, and a single hanging clock that had ticked down every Langford hearing since Walter's father argued here in 1953. At the front of the room sat Judge Elise Cantor, who'd once clerked under me 25 years ago, when she was just a nervous law student with more questions than confidence. She didn't smile when she saw me. She didn't need to. Respect runs deeper than allegiance. Garrett was already there, seated at the front with his attorney, Philip Mara, smug and sweating. Claire arrived 5 minutes late, eyes down, no lawyer. Lila didn't show. The court called us to order at 9:03. Judge Cantor opened the docket. Case number 22514, probate dispute between the estate of Walter Langford and claimant Nora Langford, widow and alleged co-owner. She glanced at me. Mrs. Langford, I understand you're representing yourself. Yes, Your Honor, I said. And then I opened the binder. First, I laid out Exhibit A through D, the red line deed, the canceled notary files, the housekeeper's verified copies, the safe deposit box testimony. Then I presented Exhibit E and F, sealed settlements proving motive and leverage, and the fire investigation records linking Lila to the arson. Finally, I introduced Exhibit G, Walter's recorded voice memo, and Exhibit H, the deed pulled from the West Library wall, complete with notarization and date stamps that predated the will Garrett had filed. The judge didn't interrupt. Neither did Mara. They couldn't. Because every page I flipped, every photograph I submitted, every signature I highlighted didn't just refute the Langford's case. It erased it. Then I turned to the court. Your Honor, I am not contesting this estate out of sentiment. I am not here for vengeance. I am here because the Langford name, my name, was nearly weaponized to commit theft in the form of legacy laundering. That's not probate. That's perjury. I looked Garrett in the eyes. And I will not let Walter's final decade be remembered as a legal fiction written by frightened children. Mara tried to argue forged timing. Judge Cantor raised a hand. Counsel, I've heard enough. She turned to Claire. Do you contest Mrs. Langford's claim? Claire stood, then shook her head. No, Your Honor. Her voice cracked, but she kept her posture. I withdraw my petition to uphold the revised will. And with that, the entire room deflated. Judge Cantor leaned forward. Then it is the judgment of this court that the amended 2022 will is invalid. The rightful estate deed remains with Nora Langford. Control of the Langford Trust is to be transferred to Mrs. Langford immediately, pending review of new trustee appointments. All prior documents not co-signed by the claimant are declared legally void. The gavel struck once. A quiet sound, but it thundered through every bone in my body. I didn't look at Garrett as I left. Didn't look at the press gathering outside. Didn't stop to speak to reporters or former colleagues or the line of curious clerks who'd gathered at the hallway corners to watch a name being reclaimed. I walked out alone, not because I was isolated, because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Outside, a breeze caught my coat as I stepped into the light. Someone asked, "Are you going to keep the Langford estate?" I smiled. No, I said. I'm going to rewrite it. The courtroom gavel had fallen. But in truth, that wasn't the moment I won. It was the moment after, the silence that followed. The collective stillness of those who had tried to erase me now realizing the burden of proof had turned back on them. That silence was my verdict. The estate transferred back into my name within 48 hours. The Langford Trust's accounts were frozen. Garrett was stripped of executor authority by judicial order. Claire, having withdrawn her claim in court, sent a handwritten apology, brief, but real. Lila? She fled. No contact. No press statement. Just a trust fund locked and legal pressure mounting. The arson investigation, now a separate criminal proceeding, would catch up with her eventually. And I wouldn't have to lift a single finger. The truth, after all, had already done the work. But I didn't celebrate. Not outwardly, because victory in cases like these doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives in paperwork. It arrives in the way the firm now addressed envelopes to me. The way the House staff began saying Mrs. Langford again, not as a formality, but with relief. It arrived in the way the estate felt quieter, but no longer heavy. The hardest moment came 2 weeks later when I stood before Walter's gravestone. Fresh flowers in one hand, the old binder in the other. I did it, I told him. I did it without burning the family name, just everything they built on top of it. I knelt, laid the binder at the foot of the stone. I kept your secrets, Walter. Even the ones you sealed. But now, they're mine. And I walked away without looking back. Because legacy, like justice, doesn't need a witness. It just needs to stand. That night, the Langford estate was still. Not the eerie stillness of betrayal. The earned kind. The peaceful aftermath of reclaiming your name. I sat at Walter's old desk, mine now, and pulled out the final document I had drafted. Not a will. A charter. The Langford Restoration Foundation. Dedicated to financial justice, probate reform, and support for victims of fraudulent disinheritance. Led by a board of women who'd once been erased. Managed by a firm that no longer carried Walter's name, but mine. I signed the bottom. With a clean pen. Sharp ink. Nora Langford, founder. The estate feels different now. Not because of the furniture, most of it is still Walter's. Not because of the layout. Those corridors have twisted the same for over a century. But because I can finally walk through it without feeling like I'm intruding. The walls don't listen for collapse anymore. They wait for instruction. I've begun restoring the East Wing. The guest annex is being converted into office space for the Langford Restoration Foundation. The staff consists of 5 women, each of them survivors of the same kind of legal erasure I nearly fell to. One was disinherited by a forged amendment. One lost her inheritance when her husband filed a falsified mental health claim. One simply didn't know she had rights until we showed her the clause. They walk in now not as clients, but as partners. Every Friday, we meet around the long table in the library. We drink coffee, spread out our files, and remind each other what happens when women write their own legacy into law. We remind each other how dangerous quiet used to be, and how powerful it is now. Garrett hasn't contacted me since the ruling. His lawyer tried to negotiate a partial settlement in exchange for reputation preservation. I declined. Claire, to her credit, visits sometimes. She never stays long. But she brings orchids. She's trying. That's enough. Lila is still hiding. The arson case is moving slowly, but I'm in no rush. The truth always catches up, especially when it's been burned into the walls. Some evenings I sit by the fireplace, binder in my lap, not reading anymore, just remembering. Walter. The way he used to circle language in red pen. The way he whispered ideas late into the night as if afraid the world might steal them before they were ready. I forgive him. Not for being weak, but for assuming I needed protection. Because I didn't. What I needed was exactly what he left me, the tools. And when a woman has tools, she doesn't burn. She builds. This week I'm drafting my new will. It's not long, but it's unbreakable. Every clause is crystal. Every signature witnessed. Every backup stored in triplicate. And at the top? Let it be known that I, Nora Langford, reclaimed what was mine not through wrath, but through record. I will die someday, but not quietly, because now quiet belongs to me. And this house will never forget my name again.